My husband wanted our neighbor in our bed. I invited her husband instead. So, my husband Oliver and I had been married for 12 years when he started acting weird around our neighbor Diane. She was 60, divorced, and had moved in next door 6 months ago. Oliver would suddenly need to do yard work whenever she was outside. He'd offer to carry her groceries, fix her fence, clean her gutters. I thought he was being neighborly until I noticed he'd spend 3 hours fixing a doorknob that needed 5 minutes of work. One night, Oliver sat me down for a serious talk. He said our marriage needed spicing up and he'd found the perfect solution. He wanted to invite Diane into our bedroom. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. He said Diane was experienced and sophisticated and could teach us things. He'd already discussed it with her and she was interested. He'd talked to our neighbor about our sex life without even asking me first. Oliver said I was being closed-minded and that mature women were having a moment. He actually used those words, having a moment, like it was some trend he'd read about online. He said Diane had been with younger couples before and knew how to make everyone comfortable. He'd been planning this for months apparently, having coffee with her while I was at work, discussing the dynamics and boundaries. Without me. He'd already told Diane I was nervous but would come around. The next day, Diane knocked on our door with cookies. She winked at me and said Oliver mentioned I needed time to process things. She touched my shoulder and said there was no pressure but she was available whenever I was ready. She actually handed me a list of her availability for the next month. Like scheduling a dentist appointment. Oliver stood there beaming like he'd won a prize. I asked Diane to leave. Oliver got mad, saying I'd embarrassed him after all the groundwork he'd laid. Groundwork. Like seducing our neighbor was a construction project. He said Diane was a catch and we were lucky she was interested. He showed me the texts between them. Dozens of messages about what they wanted to do, positions they'd Googled, items they wanted to try. My husband had been sexting our 60-year-old neighbor for 2 months. In one text, Oliver said he'd convince me even if it took time because Diane was worth it. In another, he said I was vanilla and needed someone to show me how to be fun. Diane had responded with eggplant emojis. She was 60 years old using eggplant emojis. Oliver left his phone unlocked one day and I saw he'd joined a forum about age gap experiences. His username was YoungStud38. He'd posted asking for advice on convincing reluctant wives. Someone named Golden Goddess 61 had been giving him tips. The profile picture looked familiar. It was Diane. They'd been role-playing online before approaching me. That's when I learned something interesting. Diane wasn't divorced. She was married to a man named George who traveled for work. He was a long-haul trucker gone 3 weeks out of every month. Diane wore no ring and told everyone she was single. I found George on social media. He looked nice, normal, completely unaware his wife was propositioning couples half her age. I messaged him saying I was his neighbor and had something important to discuss about Diane. He called immediately from somewhere in Nevada. Turns out Diane had done this before, 3 times in 3 different neighborhoods. George would come home to furious neighbors and have to deal with the aftermath. He was tired of it, but she always promised to stop. He said he'd be home in 2 days and would handle it. I told him to come to dinner at our house. Don't tell Diane. The night came and I told Oliver I'd changed my mind. I wanted to try something adventurous. He was thrilled, immediately texted Diane to come over. She showed up in a silk robe carrying massage oils and wine. Oliver had dimmed the lights and put on music. He'd even bought new sheets specifically for this. The doorbell rang and Oliver said to ignore it. I said I'd ordered something special for tonight. Oliver's eyes lit up, thinking I'd bought toys or outfits. I opened the door and George walked in. 6'4", 300 pounds, exhausted from driving 18 hours straight. He saw Diane in her robe and just sighed. Diane dropped the wine. It shattered everywhere. George said not again, Diane. She tried to run but slipped on the wine in her bare feet. George helped her up and apologized to us, saying this was the 4th time. Oliver asked who George was. I said this was Diane's husband, and if we were sharing partners, it was only fair George got included. Oliver went white. George stands there in my doorway. This giant man who looks like he hasn't slept in days, and Oliver keeps repeating the same question like his brain got stuck. George points at Diane with one thick finger and says her husband in this flat voice that makes it clear he's explained this before to other people in other houses. Diane's still on the floor trying to get up, her silk robe soaked with wine, and she starts making this high sound like a trapped animal. Oliver's face does this thing where all the color drains out and his mouth opens but nothing comes out, just this weird gasping noise. George walks past me into the living room without asking, his work boots leaving prints on our hardwood, and he bends down to help Diane stand up. She's bleeding from her hand where the glass cut her, little drops hitting the floor, and George wraps his flannel shirt around it without saying anything to her. Oliver finally gets words working again and asks what's happening. Who is this person? Why is he in our house? I tell Oliver this is George, Diane's husband, the one she forgot to mention during all those coffee dates and planning sessions. Diane starts talking fast, telling George this isn't what it looks like. She was just being friendly with the neighbors, bringing them wine as a welcoming gesture. George doesn't even look at her when he says don't, just that one word, but it lands like a hammer. The weight in that single word makes my chest hurt because I can hear all the other times he's said it, all the other lies he's had to listen to. Oliver's still trying to process, his eyes going from George to Diane to me like he's watching a tennis match he doesn't understand the rules to. George apologizes to us again, actually says sorry for the intrusion, and asks if he can use our bathroom to clean up Diane's hand properly. I point him toward the hall bathroom and he guides Diane that way, his hand on her elbow like she's a kid who can't be trusted not to run into traffic. Oliver stands frozen in the living room, surrounded by all his careful setup, the dimmed lights and new sheets and romantic music still playing some smooth jazz garbage. I can see him trying to make sense of this, his fantasy crashing into reality so hard it left skid marks. From the bathroom I hear water running and George's low voice saying something I can't make out, then Diane crying these small hiccuping sobs. Oliver turns to me with panic all over his face and asks what I did, why I contacted George, how I even knew about him. His voice has this accusatory edge like I'm the one who did something wrong here. I tell him I did basic research, the kind he apparently never bothered with, like checking whether our neighbor was actually single before planning to sleep with her. I remind him about Google, social media, public records, all the tools that exist for people who want to know who they're inviting into their bed. Oliver's face goes red now instead of white, and he starts to say something but stops when George comes back out with Diane. Her hands wrapped in our good towel, the white one with the blue stripes that we got as a wedding gift. George steers her to our couch and she sits down hard, won't look at anyone, just stares at the wine stain spreading across our rug. George stands in front of Oliver and tells him that his wife has done this exact thing in 3 previous neighborhoods over the past 8 years. He lists them like he's reading a grocery list, Phoenix and Denver, and some town in Oregon I've never heard of. Each time he comes home from a long haul to discover Diane's been pursuing younger couples, making elaborate plans, crossing every boundary that exists. George says the words like he's tired of hearing himself say them, like maybe if he says them enough times they'll stop being true. Oliver asks why George stays with her if she keeps doing this, and I can hear the judgment in his voice, like George is the idiot here. George gives Oliver this look that's half pity and half disgust, the kind of look you give someone who just proved they're stupider than you thought. George says marriage is complicated and he's working on it, going to therapy, trying to figure out why his wife does this, but he's not the one who needs to explain his choices right now. He points out that Oliver spent 2 months sexting someone else's wife, planning encounters, discussing positions and toys with a married woman. The word wife hits different when George says it, makes Oliver flinch like he got slapped. Diane finally speaks up from the couch, her voice all shaky and small, saying this is different, that she and Oliver had a real connection, that I was the problem for being closed-minded. George actually laughs at this. Not a happy laugh, but this bitter bark of sound that makes Diane shrink into the couch cushions. He says she used those exact same words about the couple in Phoenix, said the wife there was too uptight and didn't understand their special bond. He says she told the couple in Denver that their connection transcended normal boundaries, that they understood each other on a deeper level. The way George says it makes it sound like Diane has a script she follows, same lines for different audiences. I ask George if he wants to press charges or pursue anything legal, thinking about Oliver's texts and whether sexting counts as something actionable. George shakes his head and says he just wants to take Diane home and deal with this privately like always, but he looks at Oliver and tells him if I were smart, I'd think hard about what kind of man plans intimate encounters behind his wife's back. He says it quiet but firm, like he's giving advice he wishes someone had given him years ago. Then George helps Diane up from the couch and they leave through our front door. Diane still won't look at anyone, and I watch them cross the lawn to their house next door. Oliver and I stand in our living room surrounded by all his romantic setup, the dimmed lights making shadows on the walls, those new sheets he bought still on the couch where he'd laid them out. The music's still playing that smooth jazz, some saxophone doing slow runs that sound obscene now. Oliver opens his mouth like he's going to say something, but I hold up my hand and tell him I need him to sleep in the guest room tonight because I can't even look at him right now. My voice comes out steady even though my hands are shaking. Oliver protests immediately, says we need to talk about this, that I ambushed him, that I humiliated him in front of the neighbors. The word ambushed makes me laugh, this sharp sound that doesn't feel like it came from me. I point out that he humiliated himself by sexting a married woman for 2 months, joining online forums to discuss me like I was an obstacle to overcome, planning this whole thing without my genuine consent. I remind him about Young Stud 38 and Golden Goddess 61, about all those posts asking how to convince reluctant wives, about him calling me vanilla and saying I needed someone to show me how to be fun. Oliver keeps talking, words tumbling out about how he thought I'd see the light eventually, how he was trying to make our marriage exciting, how this was supposed to bring us closer together. He says it like he's explaining something obvious that I'm just too stubborn to understand. I ask him how destroying my trust and treating me like a problem to solve improves anything. He opens his mouth and closes it again. His face goes through these changes, trying trying to find an answer that makes sense, but nothing comes out that sounds right. He says he was trying to help, that he thought I needed this, that he was doing it for us. Every word makes it worse because he still doesn't get it. He thinks the problem is that he got caught, not that he spent months planning something without caring what I actually wanted. I tell him I'm sleeping in our bedroom tonight and he needs to take the guest room. He looks at me like I slapped him, but he nods and picks up his phone from the coffee table. The music is still playing that stupid smooth jazz and I walk over and turn it off. The silence feels heavy and thick. Oliver carries his pillow down the hall and I hear the guest room door close. I go to our bedroom and sit on the edge of the bed. The sheets are the same ones we've had for years, not the new ones he bought for his fantasy night. I lie down, but my brain won't shut off. Every time I close my eyes, I see Oliver outside fixing Diane's fence, spending 3 hours on a 5-minute job. I see him having coffee with her while I was at work, discussing boundaries and dynamics like they were planning a vacation. I see those text messages with the eggplant emojis and his username YoungStud38 asking strangers how to convince his reluctant wife. The forum post where he called me vanilla and said I needed someone to show me how to be fun. 2 months of planning behind my back. 2 months of him deciding what our marriage needed without asking me. 2 months of building this whole separate reality where Diane was sophisticated and I was the obstacle. I stare at the ceiling and count the times he volunteered to help her. Groceries, gutters, fence, doorknob, yard work. Always when she was outside, always finding reasons to be near her. And I thought he was being a good neighbor. I trusted him because that's what you do in a marriage. You trust your partner to tell you the truth, to include you in big decisions, to care about your feelings. He took that trust and used it to plan something he knew I wouldn't want. The clock says 2 a.m. and I still haven't slept. I get up and walk to the kitchen for water. The living room still smells like wine, and I can see dark stains on the tile where Diane's bottle shattered. I think about George helping her up, saying not again with that tired voice. 4 times she's done this. 4 neighborhoods of couples she's pursued while George was driving trucks across the country. And Oliver thought she was sophisticated. He thought she was a catch. He thought we were lucky she was interested. Morning light comes through the bedroom window and I feel like I didn't sleep at all. I hear Oliver moving around in the kitchen and smell coffee brewing. I get dressed and walk out there. He's standing by the coffee maker looking worse than I feel, his hair sticking up in dark circles under his eyes. He pours me a cup without asking and slides it across the counter. He says he's sorry, that he got carried away, that he made mistakes, but he loves me and wants to fix this. The words sound practiced like he's been rehearsing them since 3 a.m. I take a sip of coffee and ask him what specifically he thinks he needs to fix. He says the whole thing, the planning, not telling me everything, making me uncomfortable. I notice he doesn't say anything about the actual problem. I ask him if he thinks the issue is that you got caught or that you did it in the first place. He blinks at me like he doesn't understand the question. He says both, that he shouldn't have done it and he definitely shouldn't have let me find out like that. Let me find out. Like the problem is my discovery, not his actions. I set down my coffee cup and tell him I can't do this right now. I need space to think and I'm going to stay with Delphine for a few days. His face goes white and he asks if I'm leaving him, if this means divorce. His voice cracks on the word divorce. I tell him honestly that I don't know yet because I can't think clearly while living with someone who treated me this way. He starts to argue, saying we need to work through this together, that running away won't solve anything. I point out that I'm not running away. I'm taking space that I asked for, and he needs to respect that. He looks like he wants to say more, but something in my face stops him. I go back to the bedroom and pull out my suitcase from the closet. I pack enough clothes for a week, my toiletries, my phone charger. Oliver hovers in the doorway watching me fold shirts and roll socks. He asks when I'm coming back and I tell him I don't know. He asks if he can call me and I say only if it's important, not to pressure me or check up on me. I text Delphine asking if her offer to stay is still open. She responds in 30 seconds saying she's leaving now to pick me up. Oliver follows me to the living room where I wait by the front window with my suitcase. He keeps starting sentences and not finishing them. Finally, he asks what he's supposed to tell people if they ask where I am. I suggest he tell them the truth for once. Delphine's car pulls up and I'm out the door before Oliver can say anything else. She gets out and hugs me hard right there on the front lawn, not caring that Oliver is watching from the window or that Diane might see from next door. She takes my suitcase and loads it in her trunk and I slide into the passenger seat. As we drive away, I see Oliver standing in the doorway looking smaller than I've ever seen him. Delphine doesn't ask any questions right away. She just drives and lets me sit with my thoughts. After a few blocks, she asks what I need from her, silence or advice or just presence. I tell her I don't know yet and she nods like that's a perfectly good answer. She says her guest room is mine for as long as I need it, and Donovan already knows to give us space. I feel this wave of relief that I have somewhere to go, someone who understands that I might not have all the answers right now. We stop at a red light and Delphine reaches over and squeezes my hand. She says whatever I decide about my marriage, she's got my back. The light turns green and we drive toward her house in silence, but it's the comfortable kind where you don't need to fill the space with words. Delphine's house smells like coffee and something baking. Donovan is in the kitchen pulling cookies out of the oven, and he gives me this look that's half sympathy and half anger on my behalf. He says he's heading out to give us space, but before he goes, he needs to say something. He sets down the cookie sheet and looks at me directly. He tells me what Oliver did was messed up, and I deserve better than being treated like an obstacle to someone's fantasy. His straightforward male view somehow helps because it confirms I'm not overreacting or being too sensitive like Oliver implied. Donovan says any man who spends 2 months planning something like that without genuine consent from his wife has forgotten what marriage means. Then he grabs his keys and leaves through the garage. Delphine pours us both coffee and we sit at her kitchen table with the warm cookies between us. She asks me to walk her through everything from the beginning. I tell her about Oliver's weird behavior around Diane, the excessive helpfulness, the 3-hour doorknob fix. I tell her about the serious talk where he proposed inviting Diane into our bedroom, about discovering the texts and forum posts, about learning Diane was married and contacting George. I tell her about the confrontation with George showing up instead of participating in Oliver's planned encounter. Delphine listens without interrupting, her face getting harder as the story goes on. When I finish, she sits back and says, Oliver didn't just make one mistake. She counts on her fingers all the separate choices he made over 2 months. Each text to Diane was a choice. Each forum post asking how to convince reluctant wives was a choice. Each coffee date discussing dynamics and boundaries was a choice. Each lie about where he was or what he was doing was a choice. Every single one was a separate decision to put his wants over my comfort, safety, and dignity. She says it like she's building a case, and suddenly I see it that way too. Not one big mistake, but dozens of small betrayals that added up to something huge. I admit to Delphine that part of me feels stupid for not seeing the signs earlier. I trusted that his helpfulness toward Diane was innocent, that his long conversations with her were just being neighborly. Delphine reaches across the table and grabs my hand. She reminds me that trust in marriage is supposed to be the default. You're supposed to be able to trust your partner to tell you the truth, to include you in decisions, to care about your feelings. She says Oliver exploited that trust rather than honoring it, and that's on him, not on me. She points out that I did notice something was off. That's why I started paying attention, why I found his phone unlocked, why I looked at his messages. My gut knew something was wrong even if my brain wanted to believe the best of him. We talk for hours, going through every detail, and Delphine helps me see patterns I hadn't fully recognized. Like how Oliver's romantic gestures often involved him deciding what I wanted without asking me. How he'd plan surprise date nights to restaurants I didn't like, or buy me gifts that were more his taste than mine. How he'd tell people we were trying new things in our marriage without checking if I was comfortable with him sharing that. All these little ways he treated me like a project to manage rather than a partner to communicate with. The sun is setting outside Delphine's kitchen window, and I realize we've been talking for 6 hours. My phone has been buzzing in my pocket, but I've been ignoring it. I finally pull it out and see 12 texts from Oliver asking when I'm coming home, if we can talk, if I'm okay, if this means we're separating. Each message gets more worried and desperate. I feel annoyed that he can't even give me 1 day of space without making it about his anxiety. The next morning at Delphine's, I wake up in her guest room and for a second I forget where I am. Then everything crashes back and I remember I'm not in my own bed because my husband spent 2 months planning to sleep with our neighbor. My phone shows more texts from Oliver overnight. One at 11 asking if I'm safe. One at 2 in the morning saying he can't sleep. One at 6 asking if he can call me. I text back a single message telling him I'll talk when I'm ready, and he needs to give me the space I asked for instead of making this harder with constant contact. He responds immediately asking how long I need, and I don't answer because I genuinely don't know. Delphine knocks softly and comes in with coffee. She sits on the edge of the bed and asks how I slept. I tell her not great, and she nods like she expected that. She says she's been thinking about everything I told her yesterday, and she wants to suggest something, but I can say no if I'm not ready. I sit up and take the coffee mug. She tells me I might want to talk to a professional counselor to process everything. She recommends someone named Fiona Harvey, who works with people dealing with relationship betrayal and broken trust. I feel this immediate resistance like talking to a therapist means admitting my marriage is broken beyond fixing. Delphine must see it on my face because she says getting support isn't admitting defeat. It's actually taking control of my healing instead of letting Oliver's choices control how I feel. She points out that I've been dealing with his betrayal for days now, and having someone trained to help people through this could give me tools I don't have on my own. I think about it while drinking my coffee. Part of me wants to handle this myself, prove I don't need help, but another part knows I'm drowning and maybe reaching for a life raft isn't weakness. I ask Delphine for Fiona Harvey's number, and she's already pulling it up on her phone. I pull up Fiona Harvey's number on my phone and stare at it for a minute before pressing call. The office phone rings 3 times before someone picks up. A woman with a calm voice asks how she can help me. I tell her I need to schedule an appointment, and she asks if I've seen Fiona before. I say no, this is my first time. She asks what brings me in, and I realize I have to explain the whole mess to a stranger. I give her the short version about my husband planning to sleep with our neighbor behind my back and how I found out she was married. There's this pause on the line like she's processing what I just said. Then she tells me Fiona has experience with cases involving boundary violations and trust reconstruction. She says Fiona has an opening Thursday afternoon at 3. I take it. After I hang up, I feel this weird mix of relief and dread because making the appointment makes everything more real. Like I'm officially admitting my marriage is broken enough to need professional help. Delphine comes back into the guest room and asks if I called. I nod and tell her about the Thursday appointment. She squeezes my shoulder and says I'm doing the right thing by getting support instead of trying to handle this alone. 2 days later, I'm sitting on Delphine's couch reading when there's loud knocking on the front door. Delphine is upstairs and Donovan is in the kitchen making lunch. He goes to answer it and I hear Oliver's voice asking where I am. Donovan tells him I asked for space and Oliver needs to respect that. Oliver's voice gets louder saying I'm his wife and he has a right to talk to me. I can hear everything from the living room. Donovan's response is firm and clear. He says rights work both ways, and I have the right to space when I ask for it. Oliver tries to push past him, but Donovan blocks the doorway. He's bigger than Oliver and doesn't move. Oliver demands to know when I'm coming home, and Donovan tells him that's between me and Oliver when I'm ready to discuss it. Not before. Oliver argues for another minute, but Donovan just stands there solid and unmoved until Oliver finally gives up and leaves. I hear his car start and drive away. Donovan closes the door and comes into the living room. I thank him for running interference, and he sits down across from me. He says it was obvious Oliver needed to hear a hard boundary from another man. Then he adds that the way Oliver said she's my wife like it was an ownership claim really bothered him. He points out that Oliver was treating me like property, rather than a person with agency. That's exactly the problem with everything Oliver did. Donovan says Oliver acted like he had the right to make decisions about my body and my intimate life without my real consent, just because we're married. I feel grateful that Donovan gets it without me having to explain. Thursday comes and I drive to Fiona Harvey's office in a building downtown. The waiting room has comfortable chairs and soft lighting. I fill out intake forms asking about my medical history and current situation. When Fiona calls me back, she's younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a calm presence. Her office has a couch and 2 chairs. I take the couch. She asks me to tell her what brought me in, and I start talking. Saying everything out loud to a stranger makes it feel more real and permanent. Like once I speak the words, they become solid facts instead of this nightmare I might wake up from. Fiona listens without interrupting or judging. She takes notes sometimes, but mostly just pays attention. When I finish, she asks questions that help me see patterns I hadn't fully recognized. Like how Oliver's romantic gestures often involved him deciding what I wanted without asking me. She asks about other times he made assumptions about my preferences. I realize he did this constantly. He'd plan surprise date nights to restaurants I didn't like because he liked them. He'd buy me clothes in styles he preferred. He'd tell people we were trying new things in our marriage without checking if I was comfortable with him sharing that. All these little ways he treated me like a project to manage rather than a partner to communicate with honestly. Fiona helps me see how the neighbor situation wasn't one isolated incident, but the biggest example of a pattern that's been there for years. Fiona explains that rebuilding trust after this kind of violation isn't about forgiving quickly or moving past it. She says it's about Oliver doing sustained work to understand why he felt entitled to make these choices. He needs to demonstrate through actions over time that he's changed his thinking. She's clear that this kind of change takes months or years, not weeks. She warns me that some people apologize and promise to change, but they're really just managing their partner's feelings to get back to comfortable. Real change requires examining why someone felt entitled to violate boundaries in the first place. It means sitting with discomfort and shame instead of rushing to feel better through reassurance. She asks if Oliver has shown any understanding of why what he did was wrong, beyond just feeling bad about getting caught. I think about his apologies and realize they've mostly been about him feeling terrible and wanting me to forgive him so he can stop feeling bad. Not about understanding what he did to me. Fiona nods like she expected that answer. She says that's the difference between someone who wants to avoid consequences and someone who wants to actually change. I ask Fiona if she thinks marriages can recover from betrayals like this. She's quiet for a moment before answering. She says some do and some don't, depending on whether the person who caused harm is willing to do genuine work versus just managing their partner's feelings. She explains that recovery requires the betrayer to take full responsibility without excuses, to understand the impact of their actions, and to change the thinking that led to the betrayal in the first place. It also requires the betrayed partner to be willing to stay open to rebuilding trust if they see real change. But she's clear that not every marriage should be saved. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to leave. She says I need to watch Oliver's responses over time to see which category he falls into. Does he get defensive when I express hurt, or does he listen and validate my experience? Does he make excuses or take full responsibility? Does he expect me to get over it quickly, or does he understand this will take as long as it takes? The distinction helps me understand what I need to watch for in Oliver's behavior going forward. That evening, Oliver texts asking if I'll meet him for coffee to talk. He promises he won't pressure me about coming home. I stare at the message for a while before responding that I'll meet him tomorrow at the coffee shop on Main Street at 10. Delphine sees me looking at my phone and asks if everything is okay. I tell her about Oliver's request and that I agreed to meet him. She offers to wait in her car nearby in case I need backup. I accept because having her close makes me feel safer. I text Oliver back confirming the time and place. He responds immediately with just okay and a heart emoji. The heart emoji feels presumptuous, like he thinks we're already on our way back to normal. I don't respond to it. The next morning, I get to the coffee shop 5 minutes early. Delphine parks across the street where she can see through the window. I order tea and sit at a table in the corner. Oliver arrives exactly on time, looking terrible. He's got dark circles under his eyes and his clothes are wrinkled like he slept in them. He orders coffee and sits down across from me. Before I can say anything, he launches into an apology about how he messed up and wants to do whatever it takes to fix us. His words come fast and desperate. I hold up my hand to stop him. I tell him I need him to listen more than talk right now because his version of fixing things has been the problem. He closes his mouth and nods, but I can see how hard it is for him to not keep talking. I tell Oliver that I need him to understand he didn't just make a mistake or get carried away. He systematically planned to violate my boundaries over 2 months. He discussed me with another woman like I was an obstacle to overcome. He created an entire secret life around this fantasy with forum posts and texts and coffee dates. Each of those was a separate choice that showed he prioritized his wants over my humanity. I watch his face as I talk. He looks down at his coffee cup and his jaw tightens. I can tell he wants to defend himself, but he's trying to hold back. I keep going. I tell him every text to Diane was a choice. Every forum post asking how to convince me was a choice. Every lie about where he was going was a choice. Hundreds of choices over 2 months to betray me while pretending everything was fine. Oliver finally speaks up, trying to explain that he thought he was improving our marriage. He says he read online that couples who try new things stay together longer. He was scared we were getting boring. His voice cracks when he says boring, like that's the worst thing that could happen. I point out that his fear of boredom doesn't justify treating me like a project to fix rather than a partner to communicate with honestly. I ask him why he never just talked to me about feeling bored. Why he went straight to planning to bring someone else into our bed without having a real conversation first. He doesn't have a good answer. He mumbles something about not knowing how to bring it up. I tell him that's exactly the problem. Instead of being uncomfortable for one conversation with me, he chose to be deceptive for 2 months. He chose his comfort over my consent. I bring up the forum posts where he called me vanilla and said I needed someone to show me how to be fun. Oliver's face twists like I just hit him. He says he was venting frustration and didn't mean it the way it sounded. I tell him to consider that maybe he did mean it, and that's part of what needs to change. How he thinks about me when I don't match his fantasies. He opens his mouth to argue, then closes it. His coffee sits untouched between his hands. I can see him trying to find a way to defend himself without sounding worse. He settles on silence, which is probably the smartest choice he's made in months. I keep going because I need him to hear this. Those posts weren't just venting. They were him seeking validation from strangers that I was the problem, that I was boring and needed fixing. He wrote those things while lying next to me at night, while eating breakfast across from me, while pretending everything was fine. Oliver finally asks what I need from him to even consider working on the marriage. His voice cracks on the word marriage like he's already mourning it. I tell him I'm honest that I don't fully know yet, but it starts with him taking real responsibility without excuses or explanations that minimize what he did. He needs to sit with the discomfort of having caused harm rather than rushing to make himself feel better through my forgiveness. He nods, but I can tell he wants a checklist, a clear path to fixing this. He's still thinking in terms of actions he can take to solve the problem instead of understanding why his thinking was broken in the first place. I watch him process this and see the frustration building. He wants me to give him steps to follow so he can feel like he's doing something productive. I tell him that's exactly the issue. He's already jumping to what he needs to do instead of sitting with what he's done. I tell Oliver I'm going to stay at Delphine's for at least another week, and I need him to not contact me unless I reach out first. His whole body tenses. He starts to protest, saying we should be working on this together. That separation will make things worse. I hold firm and say this is what I need right now. He struggles with this boundary, his jaw working like he's chewing on arguments he knows he shouldn't make. After a long silence, he agrees, and I can see it's hard for him to not be in control of the timeline for reconciliation. He wants to manage when we fix things, when we move forward, when I forgive him. Taking that control away clearly bothers him more than the actual separation. Before I leave the coffee shop, Oliver reaches across the table like he might take my hand. I pull back instinctively and watch hurt flash across his face. He withdraws his hand and apologizes for overstepping. At least he's learning something about boundaries, even if it took blowing up our marriage to get here. Back at Delphine's, I feel exhausted but slightly clearer about what I need. My head hurts from the conversation and my chest feels tight. Delphine is in the kitchen making soup when I walk in. She takes one look at my face and pours me tea without asking. She sits across from me at her kitchen table and waits. I tell her about the coffee shop conversation, about Oliver's face when I mentioned the forum posts, about how he still doesn't fully get it. Delphine listens without interrupting, just nodding in the right places. When I finish, she says it sounds like Oliver is starting to hear that his perspective isn't the only one that matters. Starting to, she emphasizes, which means he's not there yet. She's right, and I know it. Oliver is doing the bare minimum of listening, but he's still focused on fixing things on his timeline. He's still thinking about what this means for him, rather than what he did to me. Delphine asks if I want to stay longer than a week, and I tell her maybe. She says her guest room is mine as long as I need it. Her husband Donovan pokes his head in to say hi and then disappears back to his office. I'm grateful they're giving me space while also making sure I'm not alone. The next afternoon, I have my second session with Fiona. I tell her about the coffee shop conversation with Oliver, about his immediate question of what he needs to do to fix this. Fiona nods like she expected this. She helps me see that Oliver's immediate jump to what do I need to do to fix this is still about him managing outcomes, rather than sitting with what he's done. That's a pattern I should watch for, she says. People who cause harm often want to rush to solutions because sitting with guilt is uncomfortable. But rushing to fix things is another way of controlling the situation, instead of letting the harmed person set the pace of healing. This makes so much sense it almost makes me angry I didn't see it myself. Oliver has been trying to control every aspect of this from the beginning. First controlling the fantasy, then controlling how I should respond to it, now controlling how fast we reconcile. Fiona asks what I want instead of what Oliver wants, and I realize I've been so focused on his actions that I haven't thought enough about my own needs. I tell her I want time. I want him to stop performing fixes and start actually changing. I want to not feel like I'm being managed. Fiona writes something in her notes and says those are good starting points for my own healing work. Fiona suggests I might benefit from talking to her colleague Malachi Harvey, who specializes in betrayal trauma. She explains that what I'm experiencing isn't just relationship problems, but actual trauma from having my reality and safety violated. The word trauma feels dramatic when she first says it. I think of trauma as something that happens to people in wars or accidents, not suburban wives whose husbands sexted the neighbor. But Fiona explains that betrayal by someone you trust and depend on creates a specific kind of trauma that affects how your brain processes safety and relationships. When I think about how I can't sleep and keep replaying everything, how I jump when I hear Oliver's voice, how I feel sick when I think about those texts, maybe trauma is the right word. It feels too big, but also accurate. Fiona gives me Malachi's card and says he has an opening this week if I want to take it. I pocket the card and say I'll think about it. But I already know I'm going to call him because I need help making sense of why I feel so broken over something other people might see as just a relationship problem. I meet with Malachi 2 days later in an office that smells like coffee and has soft lighting. He's younger than I expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and an easy way of talking that makes me feel less nervous. I give him the short version of what happened, and he doesn't look shocked or judgmental. He just nods and says, betrayal trauma happens when someone we depend on for safety becomes the source of threat. That's exactly what Oliver did when he prioritized his fantasy over my well-being. He explains that my brain is reacting to Oliver the way it would react to any threat because Oliver violated the fundamental agreement of marriage, which is that your partner keeps you safe. When that safety disappears, your nervous system goes into constant alert mode. Everything Malachi says makes me feel less crazy for my reactions. I tell him about not being able to sleep, about replaying the texts over and over, about feeling sick when Oliver tries to touch me. He says those are normal trauma responses, not signs that I'm weak or overreacting. Understanding this as trauma rather than just hurt feelings helps me make sense of my intense reactions. I'm not being dramatic. My brain is trying to protect me from someone who proved he's not safe. Malachi teaches me some techniques for managing the anxiety and intrusive thoughts. Breathing exercises that seem too simple to work, but actually help when I try them. Ways to ground myself when I start spiraling into replaying everything Oliver did. He explains that trauma lives in the body, not just the mind, so I need physical ways to calm my nervous system. Then he says something that makes me want to cry. He validates that wanting space from Oliver right now is a healthy protective response rather than me being difficult or unforgiving. This permission to protect myself feels revolutionary because I've been raised to think wives should prioritize marriage over their own needs. My mom always said marriage takes work and sacrifice. My friends talk about compromise and meeting halfway. But Malachi is telling me that protecting myself from someone who harmed me isn't being difficult. It's being smart. I leave his office feeling lighter than I have in weeks, like someone finally gave me permission to trust my own instincts about what I need. That evening, Oliver texts asking if I'll come to couples counseling with him. He's found a therapist who has availability and thinks we should start working on us together. I stare at the text for a long time before responding. I tell him I'm not ready for that yet, because he needs to do individual work first to understand his own patterns before we can work on us together. His response comes fast, saying he is doing individual work. He had one session last week. One session. Like that's enough to undo months of entitled thinking and boundary violations. I text back that I need him to do more work on himself before I'm ready to sit in a room and work on us. He sends back 3 messages in quick succession about how separation is making things worse, and we need to be working together. I can feel his frustration through the screen. Finally, he agrees to find his own therapist and do individual work. But his agreement feels reluctant, like he's humoring me rather than understanding why it matters. The next morning, Delphine mentions that Diane and George's house has been quiet since the confrontation. She says George has been home more than usual, his truck parked in the driveway most days instead of being gone for weeks. I wonder if he's actually following through on dealing with Diane's pattern this time, or if they're just lying low until the neighborhood attention fades. Part of me hopes George is setting real boundaries with Diane the way I'm trying to set them with Oliver. Another part of me thinks Diane will just wait until things calm down and start the same pattern again in 6 months or a year. People like her don't change just because they got caught. They change when facing real consequences matters more than getting what they want. I don't know if George has it in him to be that consequence. He seemed so tired when he showed up at our house, like he'd already given up but was going through the motions anyway. I see my own possible future in George's exhaustion, and it scares me. The agent's name is Lenny, and she sounds professional on the phone when I explain my situation without going into details about why I might need to sell. She asks me to bring our mortgage statements and property tax records to her office the next afternoon. I gather all the financial papers from the filing cabinet in our home office while Oliver is at work, making copies of everything so he won't notice anything missing. Lenny's office is in a strip mall near the grocery store, and when I arrive, she's already pulled up our property information on her computer. She walks me through the current market value of our house and what we still owe on the mortgage. After closing costs and agent fees, we'd split about $80,000 if we sold right now. Lenny explains that with my income alone, I could qualify for a mortgage on a smaller place, maybe a townhouse or a condo in a less expensive neighborhood. She shows me listings in my price range, and most of them look fine. Nothing special, but livable. Knowing I have options makes my chest feel less tight because I'm not stuck financially even if the marriage ends. Lenny gives me her card and says to call when I'm ready to move forward, and she doesn't push or ask questions about my timeline. I thank her and drive to a coffee shop to sit with this information for a while. The next morning, I search online for divorce attorneys in my area and find one named Robert Brooks, who has good reviews and offers free consultations. His assistant schedules me for that same afternoon during his lunch hour. Robert's office is downtown in an older building with creaky floors and dark wood paneling that makes everything feel serious. He's maybe 50 with gray hair and reading glasses, and he shakes my hand firmly before sitting across from me with a yellow legal pad. I tell him I haven't decided anything yet, but want to understand what divorce would involve if I choose that path. Robert asks basic questions about our marriage length, whether we have kids, what assets we own together. I explain about the house and our cars and retirement accounts. He writes everything down in neat columns and then explains how property division works in our state. Everything acquired during marriage gets split 50-50 unless we agree otherwise. He asks if Oliver would contest the divorce, and I say I don't know, that he's currently trying to fix things, but I'm not sure if that changes who he is fundamentally. Robert nods like he's heard this 1,000 times before. He explains the timeline for divorce in our state, how it takes at least 6 months from filing to finalization, even if everything is uncontested. If Oliver fights it, the process could take a year or more and cost tens of thousands in attorney fees. He recommends I start documenting everything now just in case, saving copies of financial records and any evidence of Oliver's behavior that might matter later. I ask what kind of evidence matters, and Robert says proof of infidelity can affect things, though in our state it mostly just speeds up the process rather than changing property division. I thank him for his time, and he says to call if I decide to move forward. Walking back to my car, I feel strange, like I'm planning for something I'm not sure I want but need to be prepared for anyway. That evening at Delphine's house, I tell her about meeting with Lenny and Robert. She asks how I'm feeling about everything, and I admit I'm relieved to know I have choices, that I'm not trapped by money or lack of information. Delphine says that's smart planning. That knowledge is power, especially when dealing with someone who took power away by lying and scheming behind my back. The next day, Oliver texts saying he found a therapist and had his first session yesterday. He says it was hard but good, that he's starting to see some things about himself he didn't recognize before. I read his text 3 times trying to figure out if he means it or if he's just saying what he thinks I want to hear. I text back that I'm glad he's doing the work, but I don't add anything encouraging because one therapy session doesn't erase months of betrayal and planning. Oliver responds asking when we can talk in person, and I tell him I'm not ready yet. He sends back a sad face emoji which feels manipulative, like he's trying to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. I show the text to Delphine and she rolls her eyes at the emoji, saying he's still trying to manage my emotions instead of dealing with his own. 2 days later, I have another appointment with Malachi. I tell him about meeting with the real estate agent and the divorce attorney, and how having that information makes me feel more in control. Malachi says gathering information is exactly the right thing to do, because it gives me agency in a situation where Oliver took my agency away by making plans without my real consent. He explains that having options reduces the panic response my brain has been stuck in, because now I know I'm making choices rather than being forced into whatever Oliver wants. We talk about what conditions I'd need to feel safe going back home if I decide to try working on the marriage. I realize I need Oliver to sleep in the guest room for a long time, not just a few nights. I need him to respect my physical space without pressuring me for affection or intimacy. I need him to keep going to therapy consistently, not just one session and then quit when it gets uncomfortable. Malachi helps me write down these requirements so I can communicate them clearly to Oliver when I'm ready. 3 weeks after the confrontation with George and Diane, I wake up one morning at Delphine's house and realize I'm ready to go home. Not because everything is fixed or because I've forgiven Oliver, but because I can't live in my friend's guest room forever, and I need to see if Oliver's changes are real or just temporary performance. I text Oliver that I want to come home, but I have conditions we need to discuss first. He calls immediately instead of texting back, and I answer. He sounds eager and hopeful, and I cut him off before he can start making promises. I tell him I need him to sleep in the guest room indefinitely, that I'm not ready to share a bed or be physically close. I need him to respect my emotional boundaries without pushing me to talk about us or work on the relationship before I'm ready. I need him to continue individual therapy every week and show me he's actually doing the work, not just going through motions. Oliver agrees to everything quickly, maybe too quickly, and I wonder if he really understands what I'm asking, or if he's just saying yes to get me back in the house. I tell him I'll come home tomorrow and he better have the guest room set up properly. The next day, Delphine helps me pack my things and drives me home. Oliver's car is in the driveway, and when I walk in with my bag, the house smells like cleaning products. He's scrubbed everything, vacuumed all the carpets, done all the laundry. The living room looks different, and it takes me a minute to realize he's rearranged the furniture, moved the couch away from where it was positioned that night when he had his romantic setup planned. He's also taken down the dimmer switch he installed and put the regular light switch back. Oliver stands in the kitchen doorway looking nervous and doesn't try to hug me or touch me. He just says welcome home quietly and asks if I need help with my bag. I tell him I've got it and carry my stuff upstairs to our bedroom, which is now just my bedroom. The guest room door is open and I can see Oliver has moved his clothes and toiletries in there, set up his laptop on the small desk. The sheets on our bed are different, new ones I've never seen before, and I'm grateful he replaced the ones he bought specifically for sleeping with Diane. Living in the same house with Oliver while keeping these boundaries feels weird and uncomfortable. The first few days he's very careful around me, giving me space and not trying to force conversations. He makes coffee in the morning and leaves it on the counter for me but doesn't hover waiting for thanks. He does his own laundry and cooks his own meals unless I specifically say I want to eat together. I watch him to see if this respectful behavior will last, or if he'll slip back into pushing for what he wants. One evening I notice Oliver has his phone face up on the coffee table, and I can see he's deleted Diane from his contacts. He shows me without me asking that he blocked her number and removed her from all his social media. He pulls up his Instagram and Facebook to prove she's not there anymore. He also shows me that he stopped following those age gap forums and deleted his account. I nod but don't thank him because these are things he should have never done in the first place, not achievements that deserve praise. The next morning I'm getting coffee, and I see through the kitchen window that Diane is outside checking her mail. Oliver comes downstairs and I watch to see what he'll do. He glances out the window, sees her, and immediately goes back upstairs to his room instead of finding an excuse to go outside like he used to. Later that week, I'm working in the yard, and Diane comes over to her side of the fence. She tries to make small talk, and I ignore her completely, pulling weeds and pretending she doesn't exist. Oliver comes outside and sees us, and instead of joining the conversation or trying to help Diane with something, he asks me if I need anything from inside, and then goes back in the house. These small actions matter more than his words, because they show he's actually changing his behavior around her, instead of just promising to. George's truck is parked in their driveway most days now, instead of being gone for weeks, and I wonder if he's finally following through on setting real boundaries with Diane, or if he's just monitoring her more closely. Either way, their house stays quiet, and I don't see Diane prowling around the neighborhood like she used to. My next therapy session with Fiona happens on a Tuesday afternoon, and I sit in her office feeling tired from all the thinking I've been doing about my marriage. She asks how I'm managing with the decisions I need to make, and I tell her some days feel clearer than others. She nods and says that's normal, that healing from betrayal doesn't follow a straight line where you feel better each day until suddenly you're fine. Some days I wake up thinking maybe Oliver and I can rebuild something stronger than what we had before, something built on real honesty instead of assumptions we never actually discussed. Other days I can't imagine ever trusting him again, because every time I remember those texts, or think about him planning this whole thing behind my back, the anger feels fresh and raw. Fiona tells me both feelings are valid and I don't have to pick one and stick with it forever. She says I'm allowed to take as much time as I need to decide about my marriage and there's no deadline for forgiveness or reconciliation. The relief I feel hearing that is huge because I've been putting pressure on myself to figure everything out quickly, to either forgive Oliver and move forward or decide to divorce and be done with it. But Fiona says real healing takes however long it takes, and rushing the process just to have an answer doesn't actually help anyone. That evening, Oliver knocks softly on the bedroom door and asks if we can have dinner together. Not to talk about our relationship or what happens next, just to eat a meal and talk about our days like we used to before everything fell apart. I agree cautiously, and we sit at the kitchen table with the pasta he made, and the conversation is awkward at first with long pauses where we both search for safe topics. He tells me about a project at work, and I mention something funny Delphine said yesterday, and slowly the tension eases just a little. I realize partway through the meal that I've actually missed this. The simple companionship of sharing food and conversation with someone who knows me well. The betrayal is still there sitting between us like a third person at the table, but so is 12 years of history and all the good parts of our marriage that existed before Oliver decided to blow everything up. When we finish eating, Oliver thanks me for agreeing to dinner and doesn't push for more, doesn't ask if this means we're making progress or if I've forgiven him. He just clears the dishes and goes back to the guest room, and I appreciate that he's learning to respect boundaries without needing praise for it. A few days later, Oliver mentions during one of our brief kitchen conversations that his therapist is helping him understand some things about himself. He's careful with how he shares this, not using it as an excuse but as genuine self-examination that feels different from his earlier defensiveness. He says he's working on understanding why he felt entitled to make decisions about our intimate life without my genuine consent, why he thought planning everything with Diane and then presenting it to me as a done deal was acceptable. His therapist apparently asked him to think about whether he saw me as a partner with equal say or as someone whose objections were obstacles to manage and overcome. Oliver admits he's realizing it was the second one, that somewhere along the way he started treating my boundaries as problems to solve rather than limits to respect. He tells me he's also examining why he prioritized his fantasy over reality, why the idea of this adventure with Diane became more important than the actual relationship he had with me. I listen without commenting much because I need to see if these insights lead to real behavior changes over time, not just awareness that fades once the immediate crisis passes. I run into George at the neighborhood mailboxes one morning, and we both freeze for a second before acknowledging each other. He apologizes again for Diane's behavior and for the whole mess, and I can see he's exhausted from dealing with this pattern that keeps repeating. I tell him I'm sorry he's dealing with this over and over, that it must be hard to come home from long work trips to discover your wife has been pursuing other people behind your back. George nods and says this time is different though, that he's actually insisted on couples therapy and given Diane clear consequences if she violates boundaries again. He says he loves her, but he's tired of being the one who just absorbs the damage and pretends everything is fine until the next neighborhood, the next couple she fixates on. I can hear the resolve in his voice, and I hope for his sake that Diane actually does the work this time, instead of just promising to change until George leaves for his next haul. Walking back to my house after talking with George, I think about boundaries and what I need going forward with Oliver. Hearing that George is finally setting real limits with Diane makes me realize I need to do the same thing, that even if Oliver and I decide to rebuild our marriage, it will have to be a completely different marriage than the one we had before. We need explicit agreements about communication and consent and respect, things we apparently didn't have clearly enough established even after 12 years together. I thought we had those things, but Oliver's actions proved we didn't, or at least that he didn't understand them the way I did. Any marriage we build from here needs to have those boundaries written down and discussed until we're both crystal clear about what they mean, not just assumed and taken for granted. 4 weeks after the confrontation, Oliver asks if I'm willing to start couples therapy together, now that we've both been doing individual work. I think about it for a full day before answering because starting couples therapy feels like a big step, like saying I'm willing to try rebuilding instead of just deciding to end things. But I realize I want to see how we communicate about difficult things with professional support before I make final decisions about whether this marriage can be saved. I tell Oliver yes, I'll try couples therapy with him, and we schedule our first session with Fiona for the following week. Our first couples therapy session is intense in ways I didn't fully expect, even though I knew it would be hard. Fiona has us both in her office, and the issues feel huge and overwhelming when we're sitting there together trying to talk about them. Oliver tries to explain his perspective, and I can feel myself getting angry listening to some of his explanations, and Fiona has to redirect us several times when the conversation starts going in circles. She helps us understand that rebuilding trust requires Oliver to be consistently trustworthy over time, while I work on healing from the betrayal, and that neither process can be rushed or forced. She says trust isn't rebuilt through grand gestures or promises. It's rebuilt through small, consistent actions day after day that prove someone has actually changed. Oliver will need to show up differently in dozens of tiny ways before I can feel safe with him again, and I'll need to do the work of processing my hurt and anger so it doesn't poison every interaction we have. Fiona is clear that this process takes months or even years, not weeks, and there's no guarantee it will work. Some marriages recover from betrayals like this, and some don't. and the outcome depends on whether both people are willing to do sustained difficult work without knowing if it will be enough. Between therapy sessions, Oliver continues respecting the boundaries we've set and doing his own individual work. I notice small changes in how he communicates with me that feel genuine, even though I stay cautious about whether they'll last. He asks instead of assuming things now, checking in about whether I'm comfortable with plans or decisions instead of just making them and expecting me to go along. When I say something makes me uncomfortable, he acknowledges it without getting defensive or trying to convince me I'm wrong. He notices when he's made me feel unheard and actually apologizes specifically for that, instead of offering vague sorry statements that don't address what he did. These changes matter because they're the opposite of how he acted during the whole Diane situation, where he made every decision without me and treated my discomfort as something to overcome, rather than respect. I watch carefully to see if this new pattern holds, or if he'll slip back into his old ways once the immediate crisis fades. I take a walk alone one afternoon and have a moment of clarity that feels important, even though it's not about Oliver specifically. I realize that regardless of whether Oliver and I stay married, I've grown through this experience in ways that matter for my whole life. I've learned to advocate for myself instead of just going along with things to keep the peace. I've learned to set boundaries and actually enforce them instead of letting people cross them repeatedly. I've learned to gather information and make decisions from a place of strength rather than fear or obligation. Before all this happened, I would have just accepted Oliver's proposal to bring Diane into our bed, even though it made me uncomfortable, because I was raised to think good wives prioritize their husband's happiness and don't make waves. But I've discovered I can make waves when something violates my core values, and the world doesn't end when I do. Whether my marriage survives or not, I'm different now in ways I don't want to undo. 2 months after the confrontation, Oliver and I have a breakthrough conversation that feels different from all our previous attempts to discuss what happened. We're sitting in the living room and he starts talking about the harm he caused, and for the first time he doesn't minimize it or try to explain it away with context about his intentions or fears. He just acknowledges that he treated me like an obstacle to his fantasy, instead of a partner whose feelings and boundaries mattered equally to his desires. He expresses genuine remorse for the months of lying and planning behind my back, for the violation of discussing our intimate life with Diane without my knowledge or consent, for making me feel like my discomfort was a problem with me rather than a reasonable response to his boundary violations. Oliver says he understands now that good intentions don't erase harmful actions, that meaning well while hurting someone doesn't make the hurt less real. For the first time since this whole thing started, I feel like he actually understands what he did, rather than just feeling bad about the consequences he's facing. This doesn't fix everything or make the betrayal disappear, but it matters because real change has to start with real understanding. I tell Oliver one night after dinner that I still don't know if I can fully trust him again, or if our marriage can actually recover from this. He sits across from me at the kitchen table and nods slowly, not trying to argue or convince me everything will be fine. He says he understands and that he doesn't expect me to have answers right now. The lack of pressure feels strange because old Oliver would have needed reassurance, would have pushed for me to promise we'd be okay, so he could feel better. This version just accepts the uncertainty and says he'll keep doing the work regardless of whether I decide to stay. I watch his face for signs he's managing my feelings to make himself comfortable, but I don't see it. He looks uncomfortable with not knowing our outcome, and he's tolerating that discomfort instead of making it my job to fix his anxiety. That itself feels like real change, like he's finally learning to sit with consequences instead of trying to control everything. Fiona guides us through creating written agreements during our next couples session. She says we need explicit understandings about communication, boundaries, and consent going forward, because we obviously didn't have them clearly established before. Oliver and I sit with notebooks and actually write down things like how we'll handle disagreements about intimacy, what counts as a boundary violation, how we'll check in with each other about comfort levels. It feels awkward putting this stuff on paper like we're drafting a contract instead of being married people who should just know how to treat each other. But Fiona points out that assuming we just know is exactly what got us here. Oliver assumed he could plan things without my real consent. I assumed he respected my boundaries without needing them spelled out. We took for granted that we were on the same page when we were reading completely different books. Writing these agreements feels like building a new foundation since the old one turned out to be made of sand. Oliver suggests adding a rule about full transparency with phone and computer access, and I'm surprised he offers that without me asking. He says he wants me to be able to check anytime I feel worried, that he has nothing to hide now and wants to prove that through action. I decide after another week of watching Oliver's sustained changes that I want to give our marriage a genuine chance to rebuild. He's been consistent for over 2 months now with the therapy, the boundaries, the communication changes, and that suggests real growth instead of just panic about losing me. I tell him I'm ready to move back into our bedroom, and his face lights up before he quickly adds that we'll move at whatever pace I need. I make it clear that sharing a bed doesn't mean everything is fixed or that trust is rebuilt. Trust comes back slowly through consistent action over time, not through one decision to try again. I'm allowed to change my mind if patterns start reverting to how they were before. Oliver agrees to all of this without trying to negotiate or push for more, and we move my things back into our room that weekend. The first night feels strange, lying next to him again after months of separation, but also familiar in ways I'd forgotten I missed. We don't do anything except sleep, and Oliver doesn't pressure for more, just tells me goodnight and stays on his side of the bed. 6 months after the confrontation with George and Diane, Oliver and I have built something different from what we had before. Our marriage now involves weekly check-ins about how we're both feeling, explicit conversations about boundaries that used to go unspoken, and ongoing therapy, both individual and together. We're more honest with each other than we ever were in the first 12 years, more intentional about making sure we both actually consent to decisions instead of one person assuming. Oliver asks before making plans that involve me, checks in about my comfort level with things instead of guessing, and acknowledges when he's made me feel unheard. I set boundaries without apologizing for having needs. Speak up when something bothers me instead of staying quiet to keep peace and trust my own judgment about what I'm willing to accept. We're both doing the work to build something healthier than what we had, something based on reality instead of assumptions about what marriage should look like. I'm genuinely happy with how far we've come, though I know we'll always carry the scar of what happened. The betrayal changed us permanently, but maybe that's not entirely bad because the marriage we had before was built on me not having full agency or voice. This new version is one where my boundaries matter as much as his desires, where we're actual partners instead of one person trying to manage the other. It's not the marriage I thought I had 12 years ago, but it's one I can actually trust because it's built on honest communication and mutual respect, rather than assumptions that turned out to be wrong.